I call the honourable member Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, can I just clarify that the question that we're debating clauses 1, 2 and 3 together, or are you debating them separately? Can I just clarify that?
It's all together.
It is all being debated together because you only called clause 1.
I'm sorry, I said actually clauses 1 to 3, and then I called clause 1, but in reality, of course, it's 1 to 3, but there are 3 separate votes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. All right, Mr.
Can we have 3 separate debates?
Mr. Chair, I'd be very happy to have 3 separate debates on this, but what I do want to talk about is the commencement of this legislation, which is clause 2 in this particular piece of legislation. It is one of my favourite topics, Mr. Robertson, but I'm not going to talk today about the meaning of the royal assent. I'm actually going to talk about the reason why Section 28 actually comes into force sometime after the rest of the legislation comes into force, because this was actually an issue that was debated quite significantly and considerably at the Select Committee as to when these clauses should come into effect. So clause 28 deals with the surrender and retention of property and searches in this legislation. Now, that's not a topic that we've canvassed significantly in this debate, but I can assure the House and members of the public that it was canvassed extensively during the Select Committee process, and the decision to amend the commencement so that this particular clause came into force after the rest of the legislation was actually made after some quite considered discussion. So the issue that comes into... So I guess to canvass what those discussions were at the Select Committee, the main points that we were talking about around the commencement or relevant to the commencement was which parts of this should be covered by legislation and which parts should be covered by the guidelines that the Ministry of Education or the Secretary of Education are to be tasked with putting in place. And that was always going to be the very difficult balance that the committee had to reach, because what we're dealing with here are issues to do with individual students' rights and the rights of individual pupils. And quite a lot of the advice that we had was that the more specific the legislation, the better, because it gave schools certainty, it gave the Secretary for Education certainty, and therefore, the legislation should be as specific as possible. Other advice that we received, however, said that we actually do need to allow some flexibility for those working in education to have quite a lot of say in how the rules around these provisions are going to be implemented. So where the committee got to was that the Secretary for Education, is now going to be required to produce a set of rules, very clear rules and guidance for schools on how these provisions will apply, what they are and aren't allowed to do in terms of the surrender and retention of student property. And so the reason that the committee got to for setting a later commencement clause for this part of the legislation is we need to allow the Secretary for Education time to develop all of those guidelines. And the development of those guidelines should be a very considered and collaborative process. We as a committee were able to consider quite a wide range of advice, and we did in fact, and the significant changes made to this to this clause within the legislation reflect what I think was a very considered debate within the committee, but also the calibre of submissions we received on this. People thought about it very carefully, and members thought very carefully about the changes that we wanted to make here. We didn't think that the legislation as drafted provided sufficient power for schools to do what they have always done in terms of the surrender and retention of student property. And so we wanted change to be made, and we have made changes to that. However, what we concluded in those debates is that we could never in legislation get it absolutely 100% right, and some aspects of the rules around this will have to be determined by the Secretary for Education, and that the only way that they can do that is probably by getting into a room the people who are going to have knowledge and expertise. So the sort of people we're talking about, obviously school leaders are critical, so school principals who deal with these issues every day, the police, agencies who advocate for children and for the rights of children. That's going to take a bit of time. Now, if we had gone with the original commencement in this bill, these new rules would have come into force probably within the next week or two when this bill is given the royal assent. But that would be completely unacceptable, because these new rules would be coming into force before A, the rules that they require had been established, but B, before schools had even actually had the time to get their head around the changes that are being proposed. Because, these are quite significant changes. They will have quite a big impact on what schools are and aren't allowed to do in terms of the surrender and retention of an individual student's property. It's controversial because, we had conflicting advice, some of which suggested that what we were looking at doing might infringe, Mr Chair, on the rights...
Honourable Member, Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Might infringe on the rights of individual children or students in the schools. And that was something that the committee didn't take lightly. But we ultimately recognised that schools have got a really difficult balance to reach here, and weighing the rights of the individual students, each individual student, to their privacy, to having their personal property kept secure, and the rights of all students and staff within a school to work in a safe and secure environment, an environment that is free particularly of drugs and weapons. And so a lot of the debate around this particular clause in the legislation centred on what schools should and shouldn't be allowed to do in regard to those issues. So, for example, drug dogs. Whether schools should be allowed to bring drug dogs in, as they have in the past, to do what are effectively random searches of student property to see whether there are drugs within them.
Of course they should.
And, well, Trevor Mallard says, of course they should, but the committee reached a point where they should be allowed to bring drug dogs into schools to search student property, but not to search students. And Trevor Mallard says why, and I'm sure he'll have he may well have a contribution to make on that.
A lot of time
but,
and stuff is in swallowers.
Yes, I don't want to get into that. But I think I'll just keep going. But Trevor Mallard's thrown me right off my train of thought with that particular unhelpful contribution, and I really don't want to. I really don't think it would be helpful.
They were searching property, not cats.
That's right. We're talking about children here, Trevor. And so the issue that we have is around the use of drug dogs, and we had some advice from agencies like the police, for example, on what they do with regard to drug dogs. Now, the police are going to be a critical agency to have input into how these rules and guidelines are developed, and we need, coming back to the commencement clause, I think it's important that the House understand why the commencement for just this clause is different to the rest of the commencement for the rest of the bill. And it is because these guidelines are going to be quite difficult to put together, or the rules actually are going to be quite difficult to put together. Issues around drug dogs, around what the appropriate use of drug dogs in schools is going to be very critical. I hope that the police certainly have engaged with this issue and with schools, I think, on these issues very constructively and carefully. Probably a bigger issue more than the police use of drug dogs, because, of course, the police have a lot of powers already to use drug dogs within schools, because a school is no different to any other area where a police officer could use a drug dog. The bigger issue really is around the use of contractors. Contractors' drug dogs, and the police, of course, there are a lot of safeguards in place around their use of drug dogs. So, to some extent, the committee was less concerned about that because they're governed by the Police Act. There's a lot of safeguards in place. So, therefore, the rules that we put in place here, and we actually made sort of specific mention of that in the bill, won't have any impact on the Police Act, and I think it was important that we were clear about that. But it will certainly have an impact on the use of drug dogs by contractors, and that is probably where most of the schools are at the moment. They are using most of the schools that do it, they're using contractors. Now, if we introduce this provision immediately, so it came into effect within the next week or two, they'd be prevented from doing what they've been doing now without really knowing what they were allowed to do. And I think that's really important. What we don't want to do in this legislation is pass new legislation that creates confusion and therefore creates, if you like, a window of opportunity for drugs and weapons to end up in our schools. So where we got to with the committee is that by bringing it into force on the 1st of January next year, it will allow the Ministry of Education or the Secretary of Education time to develop some really robust guidelines in consultation with all of the people who are involved. But then there's also a bit of a professional development requirement, I guess, for schools, because this information about what those rules and guidelines are going to be will need to be communicated to those schools. They will need to have a chance to understand it, and of course the schools themselves will need an opportunity to adapt their individual policies. Now, all of those things, if you think about it, even this time frame that we've set as the 1st of January 2014 is still quite ambitious. The Secretary of Education, I think, is probably, knowing how efficient he is, I'm sure he's already started the development of these guidelines now, or these rules now, but there's going to have to be a consultation process. Now, assuming that that's a thorough consultation process, we're looking at a couple of months for that. We're then looking at a period of time for those rules to be set, and then for the schools to implement them and adjust their own guidelines. So 1st of January for that, for section 28, is quite a reasonable one.
I'm going to call the Honourable Member Grant Robertson.